we've been living with this notion of Hamlet for about 3 years now. And the notion of Prince of Cuba is a little cheeky, you know, to actually force you to go, oh, what is that? And the Cuban port of entry, the portal in my mind, in terms of the design and look of the show and the casting of the show, evolved considerably. When I first started thinking about it, what I knew most about Cuba was 1959 and the overthrow of Batista and Castro coming into power. So I read a lot about that, and my first instinct was to go, we're going to set it in 1959, Claudius is Batista, you know, Hamlet is Che or Castro, and all these equivalencies began to lock into place. We actually began a design process. And I spoke to a lot of people, I was talking to a lot of people who are Cuban exiles and emigres in our community around here and in Miami, and began to realize that this whole notion of doing a Hamlet using a Cuban point of entry was politically fraught, and that the potential for alienating somebody was fairly high. And I encountered some very, you know, there was one very memorable discussion in my house in the second year of it, when I brought Mario Ernesto Sanchez, who is the artistic director of the Miami International Theatre Festival, Eric Fliss, who runs the South Miami-Dade Cultural Center, Eduardo Machado, possibly the most left-wing of the Cuban-American playwrights, and some other person to my house. And I think Linda and it was Debbie Tribble at the time were there observing, and it exploded into this incredibly passionate argument, because I realized what I brought together was two people who really could not be more different in their political views about Cuba, and came from a place of very deep personal hurt, because these are families that have been, you know, there's death and suffering, and there's very difficult. Anyway, what became clear in that was that the notion of vengeance is really at the heart of the way a lot of people talk about losing everything and wanting it back. I mean, the Cuban story is particularly intense for Americans. But the long and the short of that was, we moved away from 1959. It became, we would use the word reductive, and actually made it harder to actually see the play. I read an extraordinary series of books, one called Cuba Wars by Daniel Erickson. Fascinating description of America's relationship with Cuba over the past 100 years, which was incredibly helpful in crystallizing my thinking about two things, about that, the American political relationship with Cuba, but about how the play was working. It became very clear to me that the play was a story of two families who are destroyed by the destructive power of vengeance. That the desire for vengeance, as opposed to justice, can only be a dead end. It can only lead to more vengeance. Vengeance feeds on itself. But the desire for justice requires actually going, you know what? I'm going to accept the decision of an objective opinion, and it's not going to be about my emotional need to get vengeance. Very hard to get to that point. Turns out that's been the obsession of theatre from Aeschylus. That's been one of our great obsessions. How do we channel vengeance? In Hamlet, Shakespeare wrote a brilliant revenge play. We love revenge stories. I mean, what is the girl with the dragon tattoo if not a revenge story? We love to see, you know, what is Star Wars except a version of a revenge? We love revenge stories. We love to see them act out, and sometimes we get a great thrill when the villains are finally cornered, and the person who'd been victimized at the beginning gets to do horrible things to that person. There's a visceral thrill in that. Well, Shakespeare critiques that. Shakespeare actually critiques that impulse in all of us. He gives us a revenge story, but he critiques it at the same time as it's happening. Very interesting to look at a Cuban world in relation to that. And I read a book called The War Lovers by Evan Thomas. Anybody? It came out about 2 years ago. And it looks at 1898 as a crystallizing year in the story of America. 1898 was the year that the Americans invaded Cuba. It was the year that the Americans bombed the entire Spanish fleet in Manila Harbor. And it was the year that America took Puerto Rico. And the book is about how the American governing elite came to the decision to do this, and how the country was taken along on this journey. And it was Teddy Roosevelt, Cabot Lodge, Henry James's brother, who was the senator. There was a group of 6 of them, brilliant Eastern intellectuals who believed passionately that the only way America could become a country and heal the wound of the Civil War was to engage in a foreign military enterprise. Now, isn't that a fascinating thing? Isn't that a fascinating thing? And it turns out it worked. It worked for America as a country. But what happened in Cuba was the Spanish were occupying Cuba, and the native populations were in a great state of rebellion. The Americans went in with the promise of putting in, restoring a kind of a native rule, just as the British made these kinds of problems. And of course it became America. We don't need to go into the 11th. Anyway, 1898 became a crystallizing idea for me, because it allowed the world of the play